Hello again everyone, my name is Chasen. I'm a student at Centennial College's Game Development program. Welcome to part 2 of video game vehicle design. In my previous video, I explored a couple of principles and food for thought regarding designing vehicles for games. Here, I'll be attempting to put those principles into practice by actually designing vehicles for a game. I will be exploring an RTS game project me and my friends are working on, temporarily called 3 Armies. And I will be designing vehicles for some of the factions that I've created in this game. 3 Armies is set in a fantasy world, where humanity has attained a technological level similar to our world's 1930s, 1940s technology, and the nations of this world are embroiled in a chaotic geopolitical and military struggle that is essentially the game's version of the Second World War. I will be designing vehicles for 3 of the factions: Sherechia, Pulautengga, and Volgorodov. I'll be designing tanks for these factions, as it is the staple armored gun carrier for any major modern force, and also because they're the most interesting option, to be honest. Well, without further ado, let's get to designing some tanks. Now, how do I start with designing these countries' vehicles? Well, by scouring the internet for nice pictures, affectionately known as research. Since we have already established that our game's in-world tech is roughly at 1930s, 1940s levels of advancement, we can narrow down our references to World War II era military tech, relatively advanced, though still somewhat old equipment. With settings like these, our designs need to be a bit more grounded in reality than most of the other sci-fi settings. However, since this is a fictional world, completely separate and yet somewhat similar to our beloved planet Earth, we can afford to be a bit more creative with how we design the vehicles to their appropriate uses. The next major step will be the factions themselves. What of them? As mentioned in my previous video, a vehicle needs to be designed around their users, the available material and industrial capacity, what they need it for, where, and how it will be used. Let's go over each faction one by one, and put ourselves in the shoes of each faction's tank designers to establish what each country needs from a tank. First up is Sherechia. This nation's units is emphasized by their mobility, able to relocate quickly onto even the roughest terrain, and scout for enemy units from vantage points, packing enough firepower to ward off or finish off aggressors. These benefits come at the cost of having below average health pools. Their visual tank design must reflect these in-game faction trends. We must consider some in-lore factors to do this. For example, the terrain and geography of the country. Sherechia is a landlocked country of extreme terrains. Think Central Asian steppes intermingling with Alps-like mountain ranges. Mountains make for excellent defensive positions due to the rough and uneven terrain slowing down and limiting offensive troop movements, especially for heavier vehicles, which are mostly limited to road networks. This necessitates tanks with lighter net mass to allow them the ability to take as much advantage of off-road terrain as possible, in order to reach positions faster, or take up posts in spots where heavier tanks will be unable to do so. The hilly terrain will also provide natural cover for the combatants. Tanks can take advantage of this as well by going hull down, which is a term for hiding the tank so that only the turret will be in line of sight of the enemy. Thus, Sherechian tanks will need to have enough vertical turret space to allow for favorable vertical elevation and especially depression. What about their battle doctrine? The Sherechian military, both in lore and mechanics-wise, prioritize defensive warfare and hit-and-run tactics, with emphasis on using their surrounding terrain to their advantage. Being able to cover large amounts of ground quickly would allow Sherechian forces to set up defensive and ambush positions quickly. This doctrine demands a tank with good terrain performance to take advantage of off-road terrain, with armor being a tertiary priority. Engine power will also be a big concern, as an underpowered tank will not only move slowly, but will not be able to help pull itself out when it's stuck in soft terrain. Weight will also play a significant role in this. An overburdened transmission will break often and require much downtime for repairs, resulting in overall slower deployment time. Keeping the weight as low as possible, as stressed earlier, is a must. Now, I've been talking about the hard factors, as they're called, for a while now, but what about the crew, the people who are supposed to be inside the tank? The average Sherechia isn't very large, though they're not tiny either, averaging at roughly 170 centimeters for males nationwide. So the tanks will need to accommodate for the space occupied by crew members, while also keeping the tank within reasonable proportions for its role, as a tank that is too cramped for its operators will reduce overall performance in ways like slower combat response times and unnecessary discomfort. However, when all is said and done, will Sherechia's factories be able to produce tanks of the desired quality, as much as possible, as economically as possible, and as fast as possible? In lore, Sherechia's natural resources and manufacturing sectors are not the best, nor the largest worldwide, but they are growing. Hence, it is safe to say that Sherechian tanks will be relatively cheap to produce, reflected in their relatively conventional cut-and-dry design using basic construction methods like rivets to simplify production. With all this said, let's see what design can fit these requirements for the Sherechians. Behold, the MD-38-75 medium tank. 16 degrees of gun depression and measuring 3.15 meters tall enables the tank to safely fire down the ridgeline while protected by the hard mountain terrain of its homeland. Per the Sherechian doctrine of shoot and scoot tactics, the tank has a large and powerful engine providing 700 horsepower, pushing the 28-ton tank at 60 kilometers an hour, and giving enough torque to allow the MD-38 to climb steep and rocky slopes. However, the doctrine means that there is much to be wished for in terms of armor, 50mm frontally and 30 to 20mm along the sides and rear. Speaking of guns, it is quite decently armed. A 75mm field gun, capable enough of taking out light armor and infantry alike, with a coaxial machine gun to boot. Overall, while having flaws, it is still a tank suited to its users and their terrain. In this case, it is, almost literally, born into it. However, other nations may not have such specialized needs for a tank, such as an island nation state further southeast in the tropics. Our next nation is Pulautengga. Pulautengga, conversely, has a much heavier influence on its navy, becoming a very minor tank power as a result. Most of the units are emphasized by their ability to conduct attacks at very long ranges, especially their warships. However, their tanks are not as impressive in this regard. In spite of this, they still perform the role of infantry support adequately with decent all-round stats. Therefore, their design should also demonstrate this principle. In regards to Pulautengga's terrain and geography, it's a tropical archipelago nation made up of thousands of small islands and a couple of very large ones, similar to a country like Indonesia, sharing no immediate land borders with any nation. Foliage will be very thick and spread out throughout most of the region, and the ground will be softer more often due to the rains typical of tropical regions. It's the kind of ground that vehicles typically do not get along with. So a tank with as low a mass as possible will be very helpful in contending with unfriendly terrain such as mud. In regards to Pulautengga's battle doctrine, it is quite a bit different. Due to its archipelago nature, it has placed emphasis on its ocean-going and brown-water naval power as their main projection of force. Land warfare mostly prioritizes infantry and field guns, with vehicles being the supporting elements of an assault, rather than acting as an armored spearhead. Under this strategy, tanks will be delegated an infantry support and assault role of destroying gun emplacements and bunkers, while fighting other tanks or armored vehicles being a secondary priority. Cannons with high penetration will not be needed for the time being. With the infantry support role, the tank will not need a very powerful engine, as it only needs to either keep up with the walking or jogging pace of the infantry. Now, in regards to crew, the average Pulautenggan would not be very big, averaging at around 163-65 centimeters for a male and even shorter for a female. The smaller stature of Pulautenggan crews, if the tank is not crammed down to fit their size, would allow them more room to operate, and thus better performance capability of their tanks on the field. Now, is Pulautengga capable of producing these tanks? Well, Pulautengga, while rich in natural resources such as oil and rubber and having existing infrastructure to process it, can't say the same for minerals such as copper or iron. What does this mean for their tank production? Well, a less powerful engine and a smaller tank would obviously allow for less material to be used per tank, which puts less strain on the Pulautengga factories. However, with most of the iron and steel being diverted to naval craft production, there isn't much in the way of tanks, so tank production might not go as fast as other countries. This will be reflected with tanks being built of good quality, but with neither the numbers nor the economy of tanks within the same weight class. Now, let's see what design could possibly work in the mud and jungle of the Pulautengga Islands. I give you the Pahlaw 3 medium tank. Compared to the tank before it, it is a more general-purpose vehicle, but oriented towards infantry support. Armed with a considerably shorter, yet larger 95mm howitzer, firing slow, high-explosive shells, it can crack open bunkers and dislodge dug-in positions easily. It can even fight armor in a pinch, though dealing somewhat lacking damage against them. The wide tracks help the tank against soft terrain in spite of its weight, weighing in at 33 tons due to the armor that it has, 85mm frontally and 60mm on the sides and rear. Very respectable protection for its size. Its 300 horsepower engine pushes the tank at 30 km per hour at most, but it is more than enough to escort the infantry forward. The tank does most things well. It can remove hard positions and take a decent beating, in exchange for a somewhat deliberate flaw that is more a matter of doctrine than mistake. Towards the colder northward continent, however, an even larger nation has much to spare in the world of vehicle production. The last and the largest nation on our list will be Volgorodov. Volgorodov is one of the major tank factions in the game, fielding some of the most powerful tanks tier for tier. All their units emphasize the role of tank, with above average durability and with the firepower to return the favor. In turn, Volgan units move and respond relatively slowly compared to other faction units. The visual design of their tanks should also reflect this. In regards to terrain and geography, Volgorodov is a very large nation encompassing huge swaths of land, close to the northern hemisphere, similar in surface area and climate to Canada. While the country has its share of massive mountain ranges and dense temperate forests, a larger percentage of the country is rolling flat steppe. In winter, the ground is frozen solid, but in the spring and summer, the ground turns soft and very muddy. Due to the weather-dependent conditions of the ground underneath, having large, wide tracks will be of massive use in this kind of terrain. The mostly flat terrain means that tanks will be exposed bare when on the assault, necessitating for tanks with better all-around, and especially frontal protection. This increases mass, and therefore it necessitates better engine power and performance. However, the soft wet mud of spring and summer must be kept in mind when doing this. This vast expanse will also demand for Volgan tank engines to have better range than most. The battle doctrine of the Volgans is quite unique compared to the previous two. Due to geographic position and historical actions, Volgorodov is one of the few major nations in this universe to become a tank superpower, a country with infrastructure dedicated to tank production, allowing the development of heavier tanks in numbers most other nations cannot keep up with. The large swaths of flat land also allow for rapid mass movements of men and tanks by train to frontline positions. Due to the presence of two other tank superpowers on the same continent, however, the possibility of tanks having to fight each other are relatively high, so a tank which can perform both infantry support and fight tanks will be optimal. With two other tank superpowers and hundreds of kilometers of borders to guard, Volgorodov needs a lot of tanks, so production of tanks must be simplified to ease maintenance. As the existing train infrastructure in the war is the fastest way to transport men and material over a vast region, the tank should be able to be transported by trains to the front. No way a tank will be driving to the front on its own power. In terms of crew, Volgans vary quite a bit in size and height due to their multi-ethnic background. The average male soldier height measures at roughly 175 centimeters tall. Due to this large crew member size, Volgan tanks will need to be large enough to accommodate tank crewmen of this size. These will be the largest tanks that we design today. In regards of the Volgan's capability to produce tanks like these, they have a very well-developed mining and refining sector, allowing them to feed their burgeoning tank fleets at a staggering rate. Additionally, while they're not the most powerful economy nor the most technologically advanced in the world right now, they are quite high up there. As a result, Volgorodov is able to produce tanks of sufficient quality and larger numbers than pretty much any nation. However, production can be ramped up aggressively with a slight drop in quality to make tanks cheaply and quickly if need be. With the circumstances laid out, let's see what can be leveraged from Volgorodov's massive industrial complex. Here it is, the OBR 270 Ulzov. This behemoth of a war machine encompasses the word heavy, bearing a long 120mm heavy gun, able to deal with most armored threats reliably given its high penetration. It is also very heavily armored, 90mm on the sides and rear, while having a chunky 120mm frontally, giving a tank a total weight of 47 tons. What's propelling this hunk of steel forward though? A 600 horsepower engine giving a decent top speed of 35 km per hour, with okay ground performance thanks to its very wide tracks. Not bad for such a heavily laden vehicle. While some might say that the Ulzov is an example of what a good tank should be, big gun, thick armor, and all that, it is simply another tank built to the standards and needs of its users. With two countries with potentially equally threatening tanks at the doorstep, this tank will beat its match soon enough. That brings us to the end of this video, and the end of this series. I hope that these vehicle designs, while they are still quite early stage in terms of concepting, help give you guys an idea of how vehicle design for games can proceed. Not all vehicles have to be this thought out, but it does help with making the vehicles feel like they were built with a purpose by the people in your world. But I'm just rambling. It's your game after all. If you're interested in other things related to games, I highly recommend checking out the other videos up on the channel, and be sure to tune into the next ones. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the coming videos. As a fellow viewer, that is.